Happy to see a lot of people here today. My name is Valeriia Gergiieva. I will be a moderator of this session, and I'm a research fellow at Odesa Center for Nonproliferation from Ukraine. Currently, I'm a visiting fellow at the IFSH. Before I will announce the first speaker, I want to say a few words about the importance of this panel. So, as the mistrust to all international agreements now is higher than ever, this creates quite unstable international security environment, and this can provoke some states to rethink their non-nuclear weapons status. And it can cause, of course, proliferation as for deterrence purposes and as for the power projection purposes. So, when the possibility of nuclear weapons use and its consequences are on the highest agenda at the moment, so it's critically important to increase the awareness and interest in nuclear issues. So let me introduce the first speaker, Maren Vieluf. She's a researcher in the challenges to Deep Cut project at the IFSH. So welcome, Maren. Thank you.
Great. Valeriia, and good morning. So I'm going to start off the panel and talk about states' responses to the violation of the nuclear taboo in international fora. So I should definitely shorten the subtitle when I publish this paper, but it is what it is. I'm going to talk about the first meeting of states parties and the REFCON and how states reacted to the Russian nuclear threats. So I'm going to start off with a bit of context surrounding the paper, but of course also the Russian nuclear threats, describe my research interest, and give you a short overview of the data I used, and then go into my findings and conclusions, or is the nuclear taboo still intact? All right, so the context, of course, is the nuclear threats by Vladimir Putin and his regime in Moscow. He has voiced his first nuclear threat with the beginning of the war on February 24, and he said that Russia will respond immediately and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. This was a clear nuclear threat, or clear veiled nuclear threat. Everyone understood what he meant, and this is a nuclear armed state, an accepted nuclear armed state, a P5 member state that is threatening nuclear use in the context of a war of aggression on another state. So this sets a precedent, and well, it's part of deterrence to threaten nuclear use. Otherwise, no one will believe you when you say that you will use them. But this is another dimension. This is part of a war of aggression, a conventional war that has now a nuclear dimension. Since then, Russia has voiced more threats, backtracked on them, voiced different threats and backtracked on them. So we have a situation of ambiguity surrounding their intent to use nuclear weapons. Experts are pretty clear that Russia would not gain anything from using nuclear weapons, even those small nuclear weapons that everyone is talking about, or dirty bombs or whatever. They would not gain anything from using them on the battlefield. In this context, two international fora met that are distinctly concerned with nuclear weapons. This is, on the one side, the first meeting of states parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons, or Ban Treaty, which was in June. They met for 2 days. Those were 65 member states. Of course, Russia was not present, as was not any other nuclear armed state. There were also some observers present. For example, Germany was there. And another meeting in August where for 4 weeks, 191 member states met in New York to discuss anything surrounding nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses. So what was the context for my paper? On August 1st, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke to the 191 member states of the NPT and said that we urgently need to reinforce and reaffirm the 77-year-old norm against the use of nuclear weapons. So my question would be, well, did they? Did they reinforce this norm? And if so, how did they do this? So my framing of the question would be, how do states react collectively to the Russian nuclear threats in those international fora predestined to discuss these? And do they defend this norm of non-use of nuclear weapons? And if so, how? So what's my data? I've downloaded all of these statements that are publicly available that states made at those two international fora, which means 60 statements at TPNW. This was only 2 days, and more than 200 statements at NPT RevCon. Publicly available means that there were sessions that were not open to the public, so I can't look at those. There might be something in there. There are also some working papers states submitted to those conferences in advance or during the conference. And there's, of course, also the official documents like the draft final document or the, well, for NPT only the draft final document, but for TPNW also the final document that was adopted by the 65 member states. What I did was a linguistic search through those documents, looking for any remarks on the condemnation of nuclear threats as norms need practice and affirmation, and how they frame their response with regard to not only Russia, but any threat of nuclear use, and of course, to the norm itself, to anything that relates to non-use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. What I found was that a lot of states explicitly mentioned those threats and condemned them with very strong words. This is just 3 statements that I picked out randomly that call on Russia to stop its nuclear blackmail. And Germany, for example, mentioned the nuclear intimidation to shield conventional aggression. And Hungary also called to reinforce the norm against nuclear weapons at RevCon. So states made distinct reference to both the norm and the threats and condemnation of those threats. So what did I find in the end? Out of more than 200 statements, which would need more than just a linguistic search, of course, there is a clear condemnation of nuclear threats by Russia or any and all nuclear threats. And there is a distinct awareness of escalation risks. So states frame this as a risk that war could go nuclear and it should not. There's also a strong reference to the norm of non-use and the nuclear taboo, though it is oftentimes framed in a way that is not very knowledgeable. It has not existed for 77 years. It has been built for 77 years. It was a tradition. How is it a norm? What is the taboo? They name it, but they don't explain it. But they are sure that they need to uphold and strengthen it. But it's in an uneven distribution. For example, Austria is very vocal about its condemnation of threats and the need to uphold the nuclear taboo. Ireland is as well. They're both part of both treaties. Others did not say a word about it. So that would need some more research into who does not say anything and why. But it's interesting to see that consensus in the end was kind of different. Expectations for TPNW were, okay, those are the states that want to ban nuclear weapons altogether. So they will definitely condemn Russia. They did more than that. They did not less, they did more. They condemned all nuclear threats and made a strong statement to Russia and to any and all nuclear weapon states who use nuclear threats in their deterrent strategies. I think this was a very smart move. Also, due to COVID restrictions, they met before NPT. This was planned the other way around before. So the eyes were on the TPNW states and the observer states who did not, well, vote on this final document, but they were present and they were in the spirit of the TPNW there. So what we see in the NPT final draft document in the second revision is that states or Ambassador Slavinen tried to put in a condemnation of threat of use against non-nuclear weapon states party to the treaty. This would have been great. It did not go through. They had to strike it out due to Russia not being able to adopt consensus on this. In the end, Russia blocked consensus on paragraph 34 on Valeriia, another layer of nuclear threat that is in the war on Ukraine. This would have been a very strong statement, and putting it in a draft final document, although not adopted and although it was thrown out, is a strong statement by some states. We don't know by whom. So what are my conclusions? A threat or intent of nuclear use contradicts the nuclear taboo. While commitment, so practice and affirmation, strengthens it. And I guess this is what states, or most states, many states did at both conferences. There is a narrative surrounding consensus -1 at NPT. So the story goes that just Russia blocked it. But in the end, that sentence I just showed you did not go into the final document. And no one dared to try to get it in the last draft final document. And anyway, it is a strong condemnation by many states, hopefully by 190 of those 191, but we're not sure about it. So what's next? Is there a development into a nuclear taboo plus, so a prohibition of threat of use, or will there be more polarization? We will need to see with the next PrepCons, RevCons, and 2 MSP and other meetings how states will keep on reacting to the violation of the nuclear taboo. We also have to see, and I saw this in the data, that there is the bigger picture. What about deterrence? There were some states, including Austria, that condemned nuclear deterrence and the constant threat of nuclear use by anyone depending on extended security arrangements and depending on their nuclear weapons possession for their security. And there's also not only the field of tension between deterrence and the taboo. Some call it, well, it's both threatening each other or it helps each other. I'm not sure about it, but there is a tension between those two concepts. And there's also a tension between deterrence and disarmament that will need to be addressed. And states have called for this at both meetings of states parties. And with that, I conclude and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Maren. It was a very interesting presentation. Looking forward for discussion. And now this second joint presentation by Jannis Kappelmann, who is a PhD student and researcher at the University of Hamburg, and Valeriia, who is non-resident fellow at the Odesa Center for Nonproliferation. Also, she is an Open Nuclear Network visiting fellow and a management and research consultant at Atomic Reporters. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Hamburg and first time at a German conference. I'm very glad that I, together with my colleague Jannis, will be able to present what our views are on the norm implications for nuclear norms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just a word about the cover that we chose for our presentation. So this is another take, a new take on the Liberty Leading the People by Eugène Delacroix. And I think it is very appropriate in this context to see how old things that already exist totally get a different meaning in the context of this invasion, and the core fight that Ukrainian people are leading is for their own liberty.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here as well, and I hope these following remarks make sense. Apologies, we didn't have the time we wanted. Partly because organizing a conference and also doing a paper is quite a bit of work, but we'll try to make sense of what we're saying. So let's start with nuclear norms. That we've heard about one on the nuclear taboo from Maren. We'll talk about that as well in a minute. But we try to focus on more nuclear norms. Nuclear norms are not new. They have long been debated. Even Immanuel Adler started in the 90s with arms control and disarmament norms. Karin Wunderlich now is probably the most important German example, working on the norms of nuclear weapons. There are others I have here because I found the paper interesting, but there's more work on nuclear norms that we can draw upon. This is basically in the tradition of constructivist norms research, and coming from this tradition, we understand norms as collective, intersubjectively shared expectations of behavior, so they go beyond mere laws, and we see them as both socially constructed and also structuring, so coming from both sides, basically. Now we focus on the nuclear taboo. We focus on the non-threat of use of force. We focus then on the three norms that basically come from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty: peaceful use, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Starting with the nuclear taboo, we can basically see that the nuclear taboo was defined by Nina Tannenwald, who describes the nuclear taboo as a stigma against the use of nuclear weapons, sees that as unacceptable, mainly due to the grave humanitarian consequences. And what she does is she brings another explanation, additional explanation of nuclear non-use, and basically supplements the ideas that are already there of deterrence. We have other ideas of nuclear anxiety. We have ideas of luck, but it's another explanation, a norm explanation for nuclear non-use. Now we have a challenge of this nuclear taboo by repeated threats and actions. But Putin has talked about consequences never seen in history for those in Russia's way. 24th of February, he has talked about having all the tools to react to Western involvement in Ukraine in April. He has stressed that nuclear threats would be no bluff just recently in September. So there's a lot of nuclear rhetoric that is damaging the nuclear taboo. And even Nina Tannenwald herself has given an interview to The Economist saying, well, this actually damages the nuclear taboo very much. We agree with that, but we also see, and Maren has touched upon that as well, that there's defense of the nuclear taboo. So we see nuclear signals from the US, for instance. Alexander Bolfras and Stephen Herzog, for instance, say US nuclear signaling has been aimed at avoiding escalation, reassuring NATO allies. So it's really defending the nuclear taboo, I think, to a large extent. International diplomacy is working on that. If we look at what Chancellor Scholz did last week in Beijing, he brought Chinese President Xi Jinping to saying that the use of threat of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. And I think that, also working with Russian allies in that is strengthening the nuclear taboo, and also, of course, TPNW, the strong statements coming from there, as Maren said, also are defense of the nuclear taboo. But of course, we need more strengthening the nuclear taboo, because the nuclear rhetoric is still going on. It's not ending yet.
And with this, we are coming to the next norm on non-threat of use of force. And in general, you might question, okay, like, why do we have this norm? Because it's not purely nuclear. But the thing is that this norm was codified in the NPT preamble. And the reason for that was that even at that time, at the time of the signing of the treaty, the states realized that nuclear possession could become a special enabler for states to infringe on the territorial integrity of the states that do not have such nuclear weapons capabilities, and the treaty itself was limiting it. This emphasis was also reinforced through the United Nations Security Council Resolution 984, which is also known as Security Assurances Resolution, where basically this commitment to refraining from nuclear threats against non-nuclear states was reconfirmed. And then the International Court of Justice advisory opinion of 1996 clarified it that it would be illegal for a state to threaten force to secure territory from another state, or to cause it to follow or not to follow a certain political economic path in relation to the nuclear weapons. Because basically this advisory opinion is named on the legality of the threat of use of nuclear weapons. So it basically the ICJ commented that it would be illegal. And so how this norm is challenged at the moment, basically Russia actually has switched from pure deterrence, even though as we know, the 5 nuclear states issued a statement in which they said that the nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Just like short of 2 weeks after this phrase, this commitment has been quite severely undermined, because from the deterrence, which actually basically what the statement means, that the nuclear weapon state should not use the weapons for fighting, they should use it for deterrence purposes. So from this deterrence, Russia switched to coercion and basically infringing on Ukraine's territorial integrity and deterring other states, still deterring other states from intervening, but coercing Ukraine into giving in with this nuclear threat. And also additional point in this whole discussion is that the Budapest Memorandum, which promised Ukraine territorial integrity in exchange for it giving up its 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, was also obviously broken. And the states even a promise to refrain from economic coercion. And obviously this did not happen. Russia economically coerced and coerced Ukraine with nuclear weapons. There is also an important point in that there is no specific mechanism to deter or punish violations of the NPT by nuclear weapon states. And no one could, actually expect that a nuclear weapons state would infringe, for example, on the peaceful nuclear energy. And so basically it was kind of a promise not to threaten non-nuclear weapon states with nuclear weapons, but then there was no mechanism if that did not happen, because no one could actually expect that that commitment would be broken. But the norm, is still being defended, and it is defended through first. The first try was through the Security Council resolution, which was not unfortunately adopted because Russia vetoed it, obviously. But then there were 2 United Nations General Assembly resolutions in support of Ukrainian territorial integrity. And both were adopted with overwhelming majority. And of course, there is the continued mass support of the right of Ukraine for self-defense, which again is well summarized by NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. I strongly believe that NATO allies, partners around the world must continue to provide support for Ukraine, because if President Putin wins, that will send the message to Putin, but also to other authoritarian leaders that they can get their way and achieve their goals by using brutal military force. And then, even though the norm is defended, the defense seems not fully enough, and the challenges remain. Basically, it all goes back to the general system flaw of the United Nations setup, which is because all ultimate decisions have to go to the Security Council, it is blocked. And then the norm of the peaceful use obviously is broken, as our colleague in the previous session was talking about. Basically, this norm is codified in the NPT Article 4 and also is supported by other international documents. It is challenged through the attacks on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and Chernobyl nuclear power plant, it obviously is defended through the IAEA Board of Governors decisions and the IAEA mission to Zaporizhzhia, and obviously international condemnation. Again, it caused the attacks caused outrage in the whole world, because it is a really threatening and horrifying thing to do to shell nuclear power plants. The defense also, what is interesting is that the defense here of the norm can also not fully proceed, because the IAEA has a limited mandate in terms of dealing with wartime and conflict zone and protecting nuclear energy facilities or facilities related to radioactive materials in war zones. And so one of the things that the IAEA DG actually did, that as a first step to set up such norms specifically for war zones, is to add the 7 pillars for nuclear safety and security. Basically, they were the physical integrity of facilities, safety security system equipment must be fully functional at all times, uninterrupted logistical supply, and etc. At the same time, these principles have been violated on multiple occasions still, even when they were proclaimed, and obviously because they are not legally binding. They have the authority because they were adopted by and presented at the policy-making body of the IAEA, but still they are not legally binding. And also, of course, it is still questionable how continued cooperation with Russian energy operating company Rosatom affects the whole situation, because even though it is an energy operating company that directly brings revenue to the Russian state, and it is involved in nuclear cooperation, it does not face any consequences. And then coming to the non-proliferation norm, obviously it's codified through the NPT, and it is challenged by Russian continuous nuclear shielding and the failed NPT review conference, where the focus was completely distracted from disarmament and focused mostly on risk reduction and on other things, because nuclear weapon states do not want really to talk about disarmament, even though 3 of them pledged in their statements that they commit to the nuclear-free world eventually. They haven't clarified what it actually means, or don't have any practical steps to achieve that. And then obviously the non-proliferation norm is also challenged by Russia's continued cooperation with Iran, or even activated cooperation, I would say, was Iran and the DPRK, who we both know are kind of pariahs in the nuclear realm, and it sends a very bad signal to others in such circumstances. Obviously, the norm also is defended through, for example, JCPOA talks, but honestly, we all understand where the JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran stays at this moment. Iran seems pretty much uninterested in continuous negotiation. Again, TPNW conference that Maren talked to us about also defended the non-proliferation norm. And one of the interesting things is that strictly in legal terms, the right to withdraw from the NPT is allowed to be activated in case that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of the treaty have jeopardized supreme interests of the state. And obviously, Ukraine's supreme interest was jeopardized in nuclear context, its decision to stay within the treaty strengthens the norm. And obviously the challenges remain. There is lack of progress on disarmament, as I already mentioned, and there are proliferation concerns, and we don't know who else might be interested in proliferating, receiving all the signals that were sent.
All right, I'll try to be brief because I'm running out of time a bit, but I do want to talk about disarmament a bit as well. Of course, the disarmament norm is a norm, as we all understand. We see that in Article 6 of the NPT. We also see that through the advisory opinion of the ICJ in 1996, that disarmament not only has to be an objective, but also has to come to a conclusion at some point. So disarmament's norm, it's a quite strong norm, but it's been challenged as well because through the new security situation, disarmament has very often been seen and described as undesirable now and unsuitable as a reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, I think that there are practical ideas to revitalize disarmament on the table. For instance, as we talked about the TPNW MSP, there were a lot of voices there, including set of deadlines, a set of deadlines that actually make disarmament quite real and quite a attainable goal to some extent, because we have now a guideline how to disarm very much in practice. So I think that's still defended. I think that especially the TPNW conference highlights that there are voices fighting for this norm, but of course, and that's a big problem in the overall realm, is and within Zeitenwende as well, seen as undesirable and not defended as much as we could do, and that's basically continuation of a lot of years of missing disarmament that we can witness in the past decades, and also it is part of the nuclear rhetoric being still persistent. What do we take away? We think that Russia's war in Ukraine is also an attack on the fundamental international norms underpinning basically the global international order, or you want to call it, but definitely international norms concerning nuclear weapons. It's a attack on the nuclear taboo, the non-threat of use of force, non-proliferation, disarmament, peaceful use. But they are defended, the norms. Some norms seem resilient and well strengthened. The nuclear taboo, for instance, is very much defended. We have heard that others are yet to be strengthened further. For instance, disarmament, I think, is a norm that unfortunately within Zeitenwende appears rather weak. And of course, we have this international system where we have, for instance, in disarmament, a lack of progress for a very long time, and that is yet to overcome. So thank you for that, and we are looking forward to comments and questions.
Okay, Jannis and Valeriia. So, and the last presenter, but not least, is Jannis. He is a researcher at the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies Project at the IFSH. So, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you for the kind introduction. Unfortunately, I don't have any PowerPoint slides prepared, but I will give my remarks like this. So I want to talk about the communication of nuclear escalation risks in the war in Ukraine. And as Maren has already mentioned, and Jannis and Valeriia as well, the war in Ukraine has a nuclear dimension right from the beginning. So we've heard the Putin's veiled nuclear threats at the beginning of the war. And 2 days after that, Putin has also issued a special combat duty regime in the Russian army's deterrence forces. So in the news, this was taken up as heightened alert levels for Russia's nuclear forces. And then after that, experts added some nuance to the debate. And for example, Pavel Podvig highlighted that the United States and both the United States and Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles are always able to be launched within a few minutes, and that this measure may have simply increased the number of personnel at missile bases. So to me, this was an interesting parallel from the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, that in both cases, suddenly experts who were pretty much on the public radar for a long time were suddenly frequent in the news or invited to talk shows and so on. And with the paper, I wanted to see whether there's some other parallels between the two cases from a science communications perspective, and whether there's any lessons that our community can learn from the public science communication in the COVID-19 pandemic. And to put the bottom line up front, the parallels are very limited, and there's not too much we can actually learn from that case, and I will explain why in a minute. So we've heard how, for example, Pavel Podvig had added some nuance to the debate, the public debate on nuclear weapons issues. But the most pressing question addressed at experts in that regard, in that context, is whether and when Putin would use nuclear weapons. And on that question, there is a general agreement that the likelihood is pretty low, but it's of course elevated now with waning prospects for victory for Russia. And then I looked a bit further into experts' assessments on this, and I found that some have in fact tried to put a number on that and to come up with quantified probabilities for Russian nuclear weapons use. And this, to me, well, it's interesting, and I'm sure it makes for exciting headlines. But to me, they raise the question: how did they arrive at those numbers? And so, for nuclear weapons use, we don't have any reliable data distribution from which we could infer any frequential probabilities. And there's also almost no information on actually the determining factors that would lead to nuclear weapons use, or that would raise or decrease the likelihood. So from what I can tell, there's no sound methodology behind these probability estimates, and even more so, they convey a false sense of certainty. And so it's, I mean, I can understand that there's a great demand for greater certainty among the public faced with these existential risks. But what the role of science in this and experts of this should be is to acknowledge this uncertainty proactively, and thereby also lend greater credibility to the other advice and to the other research results that are relevant in this field or in the context of the war in Ukraine. So then, instead of brushing over the uncertainty and trying to come up with probability estimates and trying to find some comfort in these estimates, what experts can do is to make logical statements at how we can arrive and through what causal chains we can arrive at different outcomes, and some of that could be nuclear weapons use. So basically, that's scenario work. And in the following minute, in the remaining few minutes, I want to outline a few escalation pathways and then come back to the conclusion on where there are parallels and not so many parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine from a science communication perspective. So the escalation scenario that's been most debated in the public is that with increasing losses in Ukraine and Ukrainian forces advancing in the illegally annexed territories, and you could even imagine them advancing onto Crimea, Putin comes under increasing pressure domestically among his inner circle and so on. And then he could fear for his political survival, and in a final desperate attempt to hold on to power, he could launch nuclear weapons on Kiev, for example, to scare the Ukrainian population and force Ukraine to back down to stop their resistance. This is the one scenario of deliberate nuclear escalation that has received so far the most attention in the public debate, but there's also other scenarios of inadvertent or accidental escalation. So at the beginning of the war, I think we were very much concerned about nuclear escalation. So the German Chancellor Scholz justified his refusal to send more potent weapons to Ukraine when he said that he's doing everything in his power to prevent any escalation that would lead to the Third World War. And since then, NATO member states have increased their weapon supplies to Ukraine, provided Ukraine with more potent weapons. And this escalation so far hasn't taken place. So you might come to the conclusion that Russia is not following through on its nuclear threats. And at the same time, people at the RAND Corporation say that the Russian response might simply be delayed because Russia has been so preoccupied with the war. And the response could come in the form of so-called subconventional attacks. So attacks below the conventional level at, for example, critical infrastructure in NATO member states. And here, what comes to mind, for example, would be the explosion on the gas pipelines or sabotage of the German railway network. Although here the circumstances are not really clear, or the background is not really clear. But such subconventional attacks could go further, and if they lead to casualties in NATO member states, there could be increased public pressure to retaliate and to punish basically Russia for this. And here we could stumble into a hot conflict between NATO and Russia. And then Russia could also, in order to prevent or to deter the West from launching a large-scale conflict with Russia, Russia could rapidly escalate the conflict at the outset of the war. So you see, this is all, it sounds very speculative, and I'm not saying that any of this is very plausible, but it gives you a better idea of all the contingencies we have to take in account when it comes to possible escalation scenarios, and it makes clear that it's very difficult and quite unhelpful to try to put some probability estimates on all these many small factors. So the third pathway of escalation could also be accidental escalation. And we've seen, for example, in November 2015, a Russian fighter aircraft briefly passed into Turkish airspace and was then shot down. In that case, the two parties managed to resolve that issue without a hot conflict between NATO and Russia. In current circumstances, that would be much more difficult to step down. Also, if information about that would become public, and we have a different information environment with social media. So another reference point here would be that in the end of September, an unarmed aircraft by the British Air Force flew over the Black Sea and was shadowed by 2 Russian fighter aircraft when one of the Russian fighters accidentally released a missile in the vicinity of the British Air Force aircraft. So these incidents could also lead to a hot conflict between the NATO and Russia, and thereby shorten the pathway to nuclear escalation. But you see, again, this hinges upon so many factors that it's pretty, I would say, quite unhelpful to assume that we have some uncertainty there and that we can calculate any probability of these events. So if we come back then to the comparison between science communication in the COVID-19 pandemic and in the war in Ukraine, the difference is quite striking. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we had some empirical and experimental evidence about the spread of the virus, the effects of the virus. Scientists were able to design models that would predict the development of the pandemic under different circumstances, and they could be pretty confident in very specific policy advice. And we don't have that certainty here. We cannot, predict the future or come up with any probability estimates. So instead, what experts in this field can do is to be prudent and modest with their research results and with the communication of their research results, and map out these scenarios and really signal what policymakers should look out for and what contingencies to plan for. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, now also one more interesting part. Now we'll hear comments on papers by Graef, who is a researcher at the IFSH.
All right. Can I do it from here, or how do you have to come with it?
To hear, yeah, it's better to be more.
All right. As you can see, I'm not Kappelmann Wunderlich. I hope you're not so too disappointed about that. I will try to do my best, though. The 3 papers, I think, to some extent, are quite similar. That is, they're similar in the way the stage they're in right now. And I think you have seen their papers are much more about the empirics than they are about any kind of theory or concept, which I think makes total sense, because this is a workshop, this is a conference talking about these papers and these kind of stages. And in addition to this, all papers discuss more or less discourse, public sphere, norms, and whether norms should change or can change. So they both they include normative and empirical questions. I will start with Tim's paper. This is the freshest, so we just heard about it. As I understand, your argument is basically twofold. One is to say that when judging nuclear abuse escalation, there is an unclear basis for probability judgment, so it's an empirical claim. And then you say experts should opt for scenario-driven approaches rather than probabilistic assessments. And that, of course, is a normative claim. And you say, well, the reason for this is it provides a better basis for informing policy, if you do that, right? And I think the paper, as the other 2 papers too, has great potential, but has a lot of different topics in there, right? So I would like to try to unpack some of these topics and suggest some avenues you would like to try out or to move forward to, or not. That's your decision. But I would just mention them, and you can take what you like. So my question is, what kind of paper is this? What is the object of research? And I see 4 different topics in the paper. First is, and that's in the title, you discuss and eventually improve public science communication as kind of an evaluative normative character. I think that's the main part of the paper. But second, you want to examine why different experts, the participants of the debate, let's call them just people, hold different views. That's a different issue. Third, you problematize judgments in complex systems and discuss uncertainties and the difference between uncertainties, dangers, risks, etc. What are known unknowns, what are unknown unknowns, etc. This, of course, goes directly into very problematic, complex discussions of epistemological problems, right? And the fourth one, which is related to this, is an ethical question. It relates to a normative impetus, right? What should be done better in terms of commenting on these issues? What is the responsibility of a single researcher? I didn't take my phone, so I forgot to stop the time, so just stop me anytime I'm taking too much time. Let me briefly comment on these four ways paths I see for the paper as it moves into the future. First, the public science communication part. Here, again, that's in the paper. I think the straightforward way would to say there's a comparative work to be done. You mentioned COVID-19, there could be other cases. Why do we see different kinds of communication? And then you discuss that and you find different reasons. You mentioned some of them. On the other hand, the question is this really about science communication or is this about political engagement? Right? And you could even come up with kind of concepts like the security entrepreneurs, risk entrepreneurs. What kind of people are these people in public, right? Rather than scientists who study something in an academic realm. You mentioned scenarios in a way of how to communicate, but there might be other ways of, the normative argument can be different. You could argue that one should actually argue with the help of qualifiers in public or do a lot of hatching. I can tell you from my own experience, I do a lot of hatching when I talk about the war in Ukraine, not to be pinned down to some kind of opinion that I have. And last but not least, and that goes to one of the other points I mentioned, the responsibility of the single person that is having opinions about issues in public. So it's basically about democratic publics and how they work and how we can improve them. On the second issue, why different experts hold different views? Straightforward sociological question. It's not so much in the paper, but I think it's a possibility. There's not much literature on that. I think of nuclear realm. There's one book I know from James D. DiNardo, like 25 years ago, about the amateur strategist. Maybe you have a look at this. And that's all I can say about it. It's an interesting topic too, but it's very different from the first one I mentioned. The third one is about political judgments and complex systems, limits, possibilities, concepts. What is science? How is political science different from other sciences? What can we say in terms of the risks, uncertainties there are in that field, etc. Personally, I like this the most. I just tell you this right away. I think it's very exciting to discuss that and to ask ourselves, how can we distinguish between unknown unknowns and known unknowns, right? Between uncertainty and probability. How is this possible? How will we discuss that? And what is this a case of? You can also ask, right? Are there other examples of a political judgment beyond COVID-19 where we have a similar kind of problem? We want to discuss that in a comparative way. And last but not least, the ethical question, responsibility under complexity, right? Here again, the question is, who is doing the judging? Are they academics? Are these politicians? Are these risk entrepreneurs? Right? So who is talking and where? Is it the media? Some kind of media? Particular kind of venue? Does it make a difference? And as I mentioned before, here the question is also what kind of ethics is then possible if we have complex systems where the relationship between causes and consequences is not fully clear. It cannot actually be established in a certain way. I think I will leave it here, and not in order of the presentations, but I have Maren next, so we'll just go on and talk about your presentation. Again, as I said, I think all papers are very strong on the empirics, but not as strong on the conceptions and on the theoretical background. And that is no problem, but I will comment on that rather than the empirics, which I do not know as well as you do. My question, I think my central question is, what is the argument of the paper? What is actually the argument you want to make? Because at one point you say you want to examine the formation and current state of the nuclear taboo. And then you have different aspects of that in the paper. One research question, I'm not just sure anymore whether I wrote this down, whether it's in the paper, it doesn't matter, I'll just read it out. I came up with here is, what does Russian rhetoric behavior in this war mean for the nuclear taboo, right? The other one is more or less a topic, and that would be a question. And as I said, I think there are three different issues in the paper: the paradox of the taboo, the Russian case, and norm research within, let's say, related to NPT, TPNW communities. Again, as with Tim, I will briefly look into all three these issues, these three issues. Paradox of the taboo. I mean, I'm not an expert on the nuclear taboo and the literature of the taboo, but as far as I remember Tannenwald's original piece, this was all about use, right? And I think she has a footnote where she says there's use and it's not about deterrence, it's not about threats, etc., etc. We just discussed use. I've seen no use so far, so we're good, aren't we? So my question here is, if there's an accepted norm not to use nuclear weapons, all right, versus the possession of weapons, lack of disarmament, nuclear deterrence, all these other factors, right? How can we solve this kind of paradox? So, because the argument also in the other presentation was there are threats, and these threats will somehow undermine this norm. And it would be the case, right? But I haven't yet seen that this has been shown empirically, and this is the case, right? Let's see. Particularly if this norm is then intersubjectively shared, intersubjectively shared expectations of behavior. The question is then who shares this expectation? What about, for example, nuclear planners? Right? Would they think the same as other people in the venues you look at? Then is the nuclear taboo just a strategic usage of words in terms of rhetorical action, right? Which, however, then forms identities in a form of rhetorical entrapment. And then again, the action then indeed becomes impossible, or it has to be hidden. It has to be kind of a secrecy, not to get entrapped into that. And then how to look at the paradox within the context of the taboo in this particular case or these particular cases. Isn't the norm well and healthy? I mean, you come out in the end with the conclusion that in these two venues look at, people very much pushed back against Russia. So again, we're good, aren't we? So which aspects are actually problematic? Back to the Russian case. Again, I'm not quite sure about this relationship between nuclear use and nuclear threats, right? And how to theorize this within the context of the nuclear taboo, and whether this norm is actually undermined or not. The most interesting part for me, and this is, how to say, also true for the Jannis Valeriia's paper, is that the Russian state has, of course, uttered nuclear threats, but as you mentioned in your paper, quite explicitly, you say they also have been going back from that. They also have been publishing, de-escalatory rhetoric. And the question is, why is that? What does it mean? Isn't that strange? Well, in a way, it should at least irritate us. This is the case. What does this mean? And one idea maybe that helps here is maybe that this is already an effect of the taboo, right? Because Russia wants to be seen as a civilized state, etc., etc., and that's why they have to balance these different issues. And we see this in the empirical data. Let's see. And last but not least, venues norm research. All right. I think there is actually a very good case in your paper to develop this idea of norm research further, be more explicit about what you mean by contestation and what form of norm contestation we do actually see in these two different venues. And then what I didn't really see in the paper, though, but that might be related to the stage of the paper, is the comparison between these two venues. So when you describe the venues, you say, oh, there's a lot of things are happening, but it's not really clear to me how the one venue is different from the other. And what does this tell us about, let's see, the different states that are represented at these different venues? And again, I would say, rather than combining all these different topics, you might rather go in one direction than another. All right. And last but not least, Jannis and Valeriia's paper. In a way, that's my impression, your paper is kind of is extending the topic and the questions of Maren's paper. So you do not just focus on one norm if you want, the nuclear taboo, you add a lot of other norms too, right? Which of course makes it more complicated, and you probably also will need a different research design. What you do so far is, and you have presented here, you go through the different norms and you argue that they have been attacked or undermined, however you put it, by Russian behavior, basically. So the question is, how can you do this more systematically? Basically, I think that when you just take this, the research design, at least in my mind, is very clear. You have these different norms. You say there are these norms. you try to test them in this case, and in the end you have a conclusion. You say, well, in certain areas here or there, the norm has been undermined, others not so much, etc. And of course, you have to provide reasons why this is empirical material that actually proves this point. And all I can say really here is that, similar to Maren's paper, I would encourage you to go more into the literature of contestation. What kind of contestation do we see? What are the scope conditions for each and every norm you discuss? And the key question here, of course, is does the case at hand undermine these norms or strengthen these norms? What kind, as I said, contestation do we see? And again, the strange case of contradictory Russian behavior. Isn't that a problem? How do we look at that? What do we make of that? So basically, and I'm almost done, it's wonderful. Look into the theory of contestation, develop clear hypotheses, and you can put them up front and say, these are my hypotheses about the different norms, and then test them according to the empirical material you find, if you cannot find anything. It seems to me it's a quite rather complex paper for that. Maybe you want to, scale it down a little and cut out some of the norms and just say, leave it for another paper to look at the other norms. Right? All right.
Thank you, Alexander, for such comprehensive comments on reports. Now we can open the Q&A session, discussion, and speakers will be able to react also on the comments if they like, of course. Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you very much.
I have a question for Vieluf for the first paper, and you said you have not investigated yet which countries had made statements regarding the connection of the nuclear threat. So it just started counting them and not differentiating. That's a pity, because my question, if there's a kind of a geographical relevance, is only the Western countries. Also, the three examples you mentioned, you said only the 3 European countries, and especially Austria, which is well known for their position you already mentioned. And I would just promote you to go to more into detail, coming from qualitative aspect, more to the qualitative aspect, and then maybe you can also address the question: is it really the NPT-1, or aren't there also other countries who might question the nuclear taboo? Or maybe, as was mentioned at the end, is it the taboo only the non-use, or is it also the non-threatening? So that's also something that should be different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. More questions? Okay, I have a question as moderator. It will be a reaction also on Maren's presentation, but any of you can react because we have very similar topics. So you mentioned that Russia, if it uses nuclear weapons, it will be like no sense because there will be no benefits on the battlefield. But don't you think that even if Russia uses the nuclear weapons, it will be mostly to keep its not to lose its face, because for Russia it's maybe one of the most important issues due to its strategic culture, and especially they don't want to lose their national pride inside the country. It's also like very important, their opinion of the civil society. So I don't think it can be the reason, like the last chance to keep its face, not lose it. Maybe more questions appeared, maybe Zoom participants. Okay, and the second question, it's about the DVPW. Also, in case of Russian use of nuclear weapons, don't you think that DVPW will collapse, or maybe it will be transformed and such a precedent, like nuclear use in the non-nuclear weapons country will increase the need in DVPW and the discussions around it. So what will be the reaction? So, okay. I guess we can start answering the questions, and maybe there will be more. Maren, you are the first one.
All right, I'm going to start off on the differentiation. That was accident that I used only European state. We have lots of states from the global south being very vocal about the condemnation. We have Kiribati, who is a champion of nuclear disarmament, and also Timor-Leste. I've included a few statements. I had to cut them down in the paper itself, but it's very rough, so I did not feel very comfortable in sharing it at this stage. But many countries from various regions react to the threats and condemn them, and also jump to the defense of the nuclear taboo. But from a first glance, it's very obvious that states also have been very quiet. And I would have to go through all of those 200 plus statements and code them accordingly. Do they react? If so, how? That's a lot of work. So that will probably be my PhD project. But for the moment, it's not just Western countries. It's also very much the global south, also connected to the TPNW, as there are many global south states. There are member states of that. So that is, yes, it's a question of more qualitative analysis and not just quantitative. I fully agree with that. And also distinguishing between the threat of use and the use. We have fortunately not seen use for 77 years, so it goes against the acquis of the NPT and also against the norm of non-use to threaten use, at least in a conflict that is ongoing. So I'd say it's at least challenging, it's eroding. Jannis already mentioned the piece in The Economist by Shashank Joshi, where Nina Tannenwald was quoted. It's eroding through those threats. And so I'm very lucky that we have not seen a test of nuclear weapons use, but threatening is the next best thing, I would say. And we would have to look at that. This also goes to the norm complex, the norm of disarmament, all those norms mentioned, this whole norm complex. So the norm of non-use is not the only game in town, it's all connected. And there are two ways of looking at it. Looking at the complex, as Jannis and Valeriia did, or just looking at one. And you kind of have to do both, can't do only just one, but trying to do it. On reacting to more of what Alex said, thanks so much. This is truly helpful. And I think that Russia is very busy in creating pretexts for nuclear use that would allow them to use it in line with their doctrine and accepted rules of the deterrence game right now. So making the case for using them or not really planning on using them, but they would be on the safe side in their opinion. And that is very threatening to the taboo, and de-escalatory rhetoric kind of is a reaction to the reactions to those threats, and also to keep up the ambiguity, to keep up deterrence. It helps deterrence insofar as they don't really have to use nuclear weapons, but keep on threatening everyone and keeping everyone on their toes kind of helps their case, which links to Valeriia's question. There is no military benefit of using nuclear weapons on the battlefield. There are some scenarios of exploding a nuclear weapon somewhere else and just threatening the populations. I've not touched upon this in my paper because it's a whole different debate how this is threatening to the West and to the public. So, but in a military sense, and there is no need to bomb Ukraine if you want to take over Ukraine. That just makes no sense. But of course, I hope that Putin will not use nuclear weapons when he loses the war. But that, of course, is a whole set of different risks there are linking to the TPNW question. I don't think TPNW would collapse after nuclear weapons use. It's a strong movement, and I think it makes the case for disarmament. Those threats make the case that, as Antonio Guterres also said in his speech at NPT, the only way for a nuclear threat to go away is to let go of nuclear weapons. So the case for the TPNW is even stronger, and I'm gonna stop here and let others.
Yeah, and do you think it can collapse maybe if there will be further proliferation? Iran, Saudi Arabia. So it's like dangerous cases. Can I recollect, because it's like the role of nuclear weapons is really high now, and because it's the only chance to deter itself, and it's like in the country's minds now. So, so can it influence on TPNW, because there is still no one official nuclear weapon state who is the member of TPNW, and it won't be. And if the number of nuclear weapon states will increase, so can it influence?
I mean, from my point of view, we've seen proliferation in very few cases, and they have become pariah states. So we've seen North Korea leaving the NPT, or deciding to leave the NPT. No one really has accepted that. And we've seen Iran, and we've seen how the world has reacted. Proliferation comes with costs. And I don't see that many states would like to see those sanctions and those political and other costs that would come with it. And those are not states that are present at TPNW meetings. They don't support the ban on nuclear weapons, so they are not part of that discussion, which is a group that is very diverse and with different views, but their view on nuclear weapons is very clear.
Okay, thank you. Jannis, Valeriia, do you have some comments?
Yeah, speaking conservative, I would probably start with the last point on the TPNW, and I could have 2 points on that, because you said that nuclear weapons would be the only chance to deter. I would disagree with that. I would say that there's a lot of other options, especially in the conventional realm, to deter effectively if you want to do so. You don't need nuclear weapons for that. And the second point is that there's a misconception, I think, about what the TPNW aims to do and can do. I think TPNW probably has has to have the idea of disarmament, but I think what it really does in practice, what it does very well in practice, is to set a norm to work towards stigmatizing the possession of nuclear weapons, and that's, I think, a different thing than countries joining TPNW and then disarming in the end. So I think it's a misconception what TPNW wants to do, and I think if you frame it this way, it does the job quite well. And then the set of questions on benefits of the battlefield and society in Russia. 3 quick points on that. I don't see benefits either, as you said, but what we have to keep in mind there, and that's what Tim said, we have miscalculations with accidents. We have this whole set of stories from the Cold War and beyond. We can basically pinpoint the non-use of nuclear weapons to luck or to taboos. So we have, this retaining danger, I think. Second point, we have research, quantitative research societies usually speak against nuclear weapons. I'm really not an expert about the Russian society, but I wouldn't necessarily expect them to support nuclear use, but that's definitely something to look into. But that would be something, I think, from what we know, how societies position themselves toward nuclear weapons, something unusual. I wouldn't rule that out, of course. And the last question was about Russia losing face, and I think nuclear use, of course, would be a lot of face loss, because the norm against nuclear use is quite strong, and if you violate norms in that regard, you lose a lot of face. Yeah.
A couple of comments for me too. So first, starting with the nuclear taboo, and as previous speakers said, it's great that it hasn't been broken, and I think it's important to highlight still that this norm is like being contested, being undermined, in order not to lead to the actual use. Because if we don't talk about it now, it will be too late when this norm is broken, and it's not something similar to, for example, even nonproliferation norm. Yes, it is kind of being contested in the same way, but you know, there are ways to define when someone is starting to proliferate, like what is happening with Iran, for example. It hasn't proliferated, it hasn't gotten the nuclear weapon, but it is on the way, and it is already challenging the norm in some ways, and that's why like the norm pushes back on Iran, for example. And it's in this similar manner applicable to the nuclear taboo. It hasn't been broken, but we have to push back on it because it is being damaged by the rhetoric that applies in this case. And then regarding your question, Valeriia, on Russia's nuclear use in case we'll be trying to save space. Well, let's think about it. Again, as Maren already explained, so I won't go in detail on that. There will be no military, purely tactical advantage in using nuclear weapons in the battlefield. But it can be like a last point and you know, not to achieve anything, but like, yeah, like a hysteria or something to but try and save it the face. But like, will it actually save anyone's face? Because not only it will not give you the military advantage, and then but also everyone will realize that Russia is just a crazy actor that you know, for no reason bombed a country with nuclear weapons. Third, I don't know if any of you heard any of Ukrainian reactions to the supposed or you know, Russian nuclear use. Basically, people are choosing between, you know, their survival in both cases. In like, if Russia does not use nuclear weapons, Ukrainians have to fight for their survival under what we heard like in yesterday's presentation. You know, the Holodomor one. Like we know we have an understanding what happens if we lose to Russia, and we don't want that, because for us it's also a survival question. And if nuclear weapons is if weapons are used, then also like, yeah, it is a tragic consequence, but it does not matter that much in this sense, whether it's survival in a protracted period of time under the suppression and physical annihilation of a potential like regime that if that comes if Russia succeeds in this war against Ukraine, or in like a nuclear weapons use, which basically, you know, the survival question is key. So the people reacted, okay, I mean, we are under threat in either way, so they can say whatever they want, we will not accept it. And that was a slap in the face. And this is actually also answering the question, okay, why Russian rhetoric changed to the kind of like the escalatory rhetoric, because and like saying that, oh, we actually did not threaten anyone with nuclear weapons, and that was intentional from the very beginning, because they did cover their threats. They never said like, we are going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, unless it was like Dmitry Medvedev who actually did say that they will use if they will lose. But he was not acting in an official capacity when he said that. It was on his telegram. So basically understanding what the reaction was in the world and what the reaction is in Ukraine, they dialed down on this rhetoric. And yeah, that's what I wanted. And that doesn't save their face. That's the argument that I have.
Thank you. Yes, Alexander, do you have a comment?
If someone wants to, comment on my comment before me, that's fine.
I can just maybe say a few words on the possibility of nuclear use. I think the responses so far have been pretty exemplary of appeals more broadly. So we all agree that it would make no sense for Russia, and that there would be no would probably be no military or political advantages. But I mean, the question is, as Jannis said, whether Putin also agrees with us on this. And then if you look back 1.5 years ago, we all would have said it's not plausible that Russia would invade Crimea, that there would be a large-scale war in Europe, and this is maybe only to intimidate NATO member states and to get concessions with these weird public diplomacy last winter. And still we're in the situation today. So I think when it comes to the plausibility of all these scenarios, we shouldn't only settle for those scenarios that seem very, very probable or very plausible to us, but think also about the maybe less plausible scenarios. And this is where I think scenario work can be most useful, because the obvious cases and the obvious outcomes are those where you have that you plan for in any case. But something like this, or something like Russia's invasion into Ukraine right now, is something that you couldn't, or that was harder to foresee in advance, and where forecasting and scenario work could have made a difference when it comes to planning for these contingencies. So I think in these much more uncertain times in this world after the 24th of February, there's really a greater value that such scenario work can bring to research.
Thank you. Yes, Alexander.
Yeah, before we have to, I think, to close, but 3 quick points. I think you're absolutely right, because there is a difference between, like I mentioned before, between being rational and being right? So an event can, well, even if it's objectively probable, it never has to come to pass, right? So that's not a problem. That's just how the world works, and our methods, our approaches have to be adequate to this problem, right? Quick note though on this Russian rhetoric, because actually I noted this example in the video if you cite in the paper, this Telegram notion that openly, as you said, he threatened Ukraine with nuclear use and use of nuclear weapons if Russia would lose. Then he adds, and that's quite interesting, he adds, I looked up the Telegram, right? He adds, and then he says, well, he specifies that in Ukrainian victory means returning all territories, which is the reason for the application of paragraph 19 of the fundamentals of Russia's nuclear doctrine, right? So nuclear use is justified. And then he asks rhetorically, and then who's planning a nuclear conflict, may I ask? What is this but the direct provocation of a world war using nuclear weapons? Not by Russia, of course, right? By Ukraine. The question though is this genuine? Is this a genuine position, or is it just rhetoric, just strategy? I think that's not intuitively clear. Right? At least somehow it should disturb us what the video in this case means. In addition to this, very quickly, also very strange, in the Russian de-escalatory rhetoric, you will find that they always refer to the military doctrine, not to the fundamentals, even though you cited, and only does 2, by the way. But the Russians forget that actually their real doctrine, the published doctrine, has 2 other points, which are not mentioned in these papers by the MFA, etc., which is about the start of ballistic missiles, right, having reliable information about the start of ballistic missiles, and that's more critical, attacks against critical infrastructure that could undermine second strike capabilities. Never mentioned in public so far. They always rely on 20 years old military doctrine. No idea why, but it's interesting why they do this. So, there are these questions. Why is it that they have the rhetoric they have, and whether it's strategic, whether it's genuine, whether it's just rhetoric, has to be decided.
Thank you very much. We are just perfectly on time. So yeah, I want to thank first of all the panelists for great discussion, for wonderful presentations, for your involvement. And thank you, of course, for the audience who were here. Not a lot, but I guess the best part of the conference.